Hello, Potomac Crossing Ward. Talking about Alma 17 through 22. And I'm going to do some general comments on the entire chunk, and then I'm just going to do some comments on chapter 17 to explain some of the context of what's going on there. So for the general comments on Alma 17 through 22, the overall message of these chapters is Lamanite hostility towards the Nephites can be overcome by selfless service and preaching the gospel. There's no substantial difference when it comes to accepting the gospel with respect to the Lamanites as compared to the Nephites. The superficial difference is historical bias on both sides. And if you look at Jacob 3:5 and Mosiah 10:12 through 17 and Alma 20:10 through 13, it's pretty clear that there's bias on both sides with both populations. It's not just one-sided. And this historical bias can be overcome by people who are willing to let go of that bias. Now, contrasted with the service that Ammon and Aaron provide is the negative influence of apostate Nephites, which hardens the local Lamanites further. So we see good Nephites, Ammon and Aaron, contrasted with bad Nephites, the Amlicites and the Amulonites, and what kind of impact the Nephites have on the Lamanites for both good and evil. A clear underlying message through the text is the Lord is guiding and protecting the sons of Mosiah on their mission, as promised to their father and King Mosiah in Mosiah 28:7. All of the sons face significant opposition and mortal threats, but all persevere and ultimately experience extraordinary success. Okay, so now some comments specifically on Alma chapter 17. So in the chronology here, this chapter initially follows the chronology from the preceding chapter in verse 1, but then verses 2 through 6 jump back some 14 years. We see that in verse 4, to the start of the ministry to the Lamanites, performed by the sons of Mosiah in 77 BC. From verse 6 on, the text goes backwards in time, back to 91 BC. And then the text returns to the chronology of verse 1 through 5 in 27:16. So you have a large chunk of text which moves back in time to cover what's happened when the sons of Mosiah went off to do their missionary service. Some comments on geography. The setting of the latter part of the chapter with the conflict surrounding the scattering of the flocks suggests a geography that is open and relatively flat, as Ammon is successful casting stones at a considerable distance. This would not be possible in a forested area or a rugged terrain with lots of natural cover. There being pasture with few open water bodies suggests it's relatively arid or it's summertime, as if there were other water sources available. Those would have been used instead, given the clear and compelling threat that was well known. The pasture could have been up in the hills, and then they would have had to descend into the flats to water the flocks, leaving them open to attack. And the references to horse and chariots in the next chapter also suggest a flat and open geography. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was the acceptance of Ammon by Lamoni. Now, in chapter 17, Mormon sets up the Lamanites as generally hostile in verses 14 to 15. And then he tells us that the typical response to Nephites that they capture is to kill, imprison, or throw them out in verse 20. But when Ammon shows up, Lamoni asks him one question, and he is then pleased with him and offers him one of his daughters to marry in verses 21 through 24. This is seemingly a very quick turnaround from the expected response. So what's going on here? It's likely Mormon omitted some details of the initial conversation between Lamoni and Ammon. The one question that's documented that Lamoni asks Ammon is a loaded one, as most Nephites taken captive would be fearful and wanting to leave, given the threat of death or imprisonment. Ammon's response is the opposite of what the typical Nephite would say, so this would have been in Ammon's favor. Two additional details in the text suggest there was additional information exchanged. First, Lamoni offers a daughter in marriage to Ammon, which he then declines. Lamoni, being king and his daughter is a princess, suggests Lamoni understands Ammon to be a prince as well. It seems unlikely Lamoni would offer his daughter to a commoner Nephite. Supporting this reading is after the entire ordeal with the flocks at the watering hole. During the report to Lamoni, the servants refer to Ammon as Rabbanah, which is being interpreted powerful or great king, considering their kings to be powerful. We see that in chapter 18, verse 13. Note the preceding conversation is Ammon's connection to the Great Spirit. There's no conversation over him being a king or not. However, that is what the servant is calling him. He's calling him a powerful king. This suggests Ammon's connection to royalty was known, he being the son of the Nephite king Mosiah, a literal prince. If there's a tradition among the Lamanites that kings are powerful, then clearly Ammon fits this tradition. Recall that Lamoni is both a prince and a king. He's king over the people of Ishmael, but his father is a king over all the Lamanites. So Lamoni is also a prince. So Lamoni is both a king and a prince. This suggests in the initial conversation with Lamoni, it came out that Ammon was a Nephite prince. This would explain why Lamoni offers his daughter in marriage, because Ammon is royalty, and it could benefit Lamoni and the people of Ishmael to have royal connections to the Nephites. Second, Mormon notes Ammon in referring to the Lamanites' servants as those whom he termed to be his brethren. We see that in verse 30. Ammon is speaking to them as his brothers and equals, whom he labors with and whom he wants to save, and whom he shares an equal fate with. So note when the servants were saying, "Hey, this is terrible," they start lamenting and crying. This is terrible. We're going to get killed. Ammon says, "Hey, this isn't me. I'm not going to get killed. You guys are going to get killed." He says, "No, we're all in this together. Let's save each other so that we won't all be killed." So Ammon is uniting himself with them. Ammon does not see himself as separate from or better than them or different from them. Ammon explicitly identifies them as brothers. It seems likely that this feeling would have been made known at the initial interview with Lamoni. Ammon is not fearful of them. He considers them brothers and wants to live among them. So these details together help fill in why Lamoni was pleased with Ammon. He probably introduced himself as royalty and expressed his feeling that they were brothers, that they were all, one big family. Now, with respect to Ammon's refusal to take Lamoni's daughter to wife, it doesn't appear to have caused any offense. We would think like if Lamoni offered him his daughter and then he declines, might he have taken offense at that? But it doesn't seem to be the case. So perhaps Ammon's inability to pay bride price. Now, remember that Israelite tradition of matan and mahar, which is the bride price and bride gifts, is typically negotiated by the groom's father. Now, in this case, Ammon is away from his father. His father's not present to enter into negotiations with Lamoni, so it complicates things. So his inability to pay the bride price would have been connected to his request to be, or could have been connected to his request to be Lamoni's servant. Since Ammon couldn't pay, and his father Mosiah was absent, Ammon could serve Lamoni in lieu of bride price. There are examples of that in the Old Testament. Now, at issue here is how much of these Israelite traditions persisted among the Nephites and Lamanites some hundreds of years after separation from the Israelite population in general. It's impossible for us to discern that, but at least this fits the context, and it might help explain some of the obscurities of what's going on in the text. So, there's no way we'll ever know what the Nephite and Lamanite traditions are, but if we just assume that they follow the Israelite tradition, then it would explain why Ammon turning Lamoni down on marrying a daughter was not offensive, and him serving him as a servant was acceptable. And then he would also be connected because he's royalty. So that's just some of the stuff that, in general, that I wanted to deal with in discussing these chapters. I think the rest of the text is pretty straightforward as to what's happening. As far as, I think, Ammon whacking off guys' arms and the whole discussion and conversation, and then converting Lamoni, and then Aaron goes and repeats a similar process of conversion with Lamoni's father. So I think that's pretty straightforward. So that'll be it for this one.